Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the English with Grace podcast. This is a centralized hub for students, teachers, and English language learners to practice their English and listen to the differing opinions of other English speakers. The content and focus of this podcast will vary, and my goal is to introduce listeners to a variety of perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences as we discuss topics that are also presented in my English with Grace conversation classes. So I'm very excited to have you here. I hope you enjoy this discussion, and of course, like and subscribe if you like it. And I look forward to seeing you in some of our upcoming conversation classes. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the English with Grace podcast. Today, we're going to talk all about relationships, and I've invited Chris to discuss this topic with us. Chris, if you could just start with a quick introduction for my listeners, name, pronouns, and then your cultural background and upbringing.
Of course. First off, thank you, Grace, and thank you for everybody that's listening. My name is Chris Miller. My pronouns are he and him, and a little bit of my cultural background is I grew up in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, which is northeast Oklahoma, so the state right above Texas. My family was a family of four, so I'm the baby of four. And when I turned 23, I moved away from Oklahoma to North Carolina, where I met my wife, and we now live in Kansas.
Yes. And we confirmed before this that Oklahoma is the Midwest.
We
and
think.
and Kansas as well. So we're gonna have to figure out. A lot of people have talked about this, Chris, on the podcast. All these different states and that they're part of the Midwest. So I'm trying to interview people from the Midwest, and I think I'll have to bring you back for that group episode.
That would be really cool. It would be the best of the Midwest.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. There we go.
Yeah.
All right. And then, Chris, can you tell us a little bit about your career or your interests right now and why you are the person to interview about this topic?
Yes. So we were talking prior to this, but we both really enjoy people connecting.
Mhm.
I know that there's a lot of different ways to do that. English is a big way to do that around here. I went to college for communication. So I studied a few different things. I studied public speaking. I studied organizational communication. So how businesses communicate to people who work with them, to the
Mhm.
community they're a part of, or to the people who are buying their product, their clientele. Then I also studied what we call interpersonal communication. So looking more in depth at how one human connects to another human. And
Mhm.
there's so many different things. You have your tone and your pacing and what words you choose to use and how you use those words. And I imagine that's your bread and butter. So looking into that a little bit. Now, I decided to go to grad school after 4 years of undergraduate, and I began to teach public speaking.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so I would teach public speaking to college students, and I would get to see in August at the beginning of the semester, people would be incredibly nervous. And then come December, after 16 weeks of practice, we actually see personality bleed through a little bit.
Mhm.
People are making jokes, they're laughing. So seeing this process of growth, and I got to witness people gain the ability to express themselves.
Mhm.
They were actually able to, all the stuff going on in our head, we're able to get it out if we practice being able to communicate. So I find it incredibly important. Now I start to go work for different companies, and I get this job where I'm flying around the country every week, suit and tie, working with the US military.
Ooh.
I would go to these bases, I'd drive in the base, they'd have armed guards and
Mhm.
show them my badge. And I would help them with their software, their healthcare software, and I would talk to them about how to get the software. It was an interesting job, but the big duty that I had, the responsibility, was talking to people, making sure that they knew who I was. If they had any questions, I would get them to the people who knew how to answer them. And this was good because I got to learn how to talk with a variety of people. And then I quit my job because I was traveling way too much. And I
Mhm.
have since been running a podcast called the Talk to People podcast,
Yes.
and writing a newsletter and working with other podcasts and doing some different stuff. So
Mhm.
I'm really passionate about talking to people, and I've looked into it a lot, which is why we're talking about relationships today.
Yes. Okay. I love this. And at the end, I'm going to ask you to share where my followers can find you and the Talk to People podcast, right?
You got it.
Okay. So we'll talk more about that. You said an expression I just really want to circle back to. You said, I
Yeah.
imagine that's your bread and butter, I think.
Oh,
Can
nice.
you break that down just a little bit? That's a great one for my students.
Yes, that is a good expression. And it's funny because I wasn't even thinking about it when I
I
said
know.
it.
I know.
So it's so natural nowadays. But the reason why I said bread and butter is I was saying that's your specialty or that's something that you're really good at, something
Mhm.
that you've spent a lot of time doing. And because of that, you are an expert in a sense. You
Mhm.
have expertise there.
Yeah, that's great. No, perfect expression. And I know I haven't told my students what that means yet, so that'll be a fun one to talk
I
about.
wonder why it's bread and butter though. Maybe because it's like the most simple thing, or
Yeah, I haven't thought that deeply about it, but that's definitely, I think, an American probably
yes,
expression. I'll have to ask my other English speaking friends from around the world if they say that's your bread and butter.
right.
Okay. And then you kind of touched on this. So that's your background. Why is this topic so important, though? Like, why is communication and building relationships through communication so important?
It's really important because we have a lot of things that happen in our life and we have a lot of people around us. And there's physical fitness, which is how healthy we are. If we're injured, if we're feeling sick, we want to get that taken care of. We have mental health. So if we're feeling down or lonely or sad or depressed. And then we also have this idea of like relational health or social fitness,
Hmm.
which looks at how you're living with the people around you. Do you have good relationships? The reason being is if you have good relationships, you get to share life with people, you get to do fun things with people. The moments where you deal with tragedy, say something happens with your family where you may lose a loved one, or maybe you lose your favorite job, you get to
Hmm.
talk to people about it. So there's one thing that I should mention, and it's called the Harvard Happiness Study. And in
Okay.
1938, Harvard University, they gathered close to 300 sophomores that go to Harvard and they begin to study them. They wanted to look at everything about them. And the reason why was they wanted to know what made a Harvard man. What
Okay.
was the traits, the attributes that led to someone getting to the point to where they could go to Harvard, which is
Hmm.
historically known as one of the top institutions of the world. So they begin to study these people for decades. And after a while, they included their wives and their kids, and the group grew to almost 1,000 people.
Hmm.
And the biggest result that they found from this, and they weren't expecting to find it, but the people who had the best relationships experienced the most happiness. They experienced the least amount of physical pain. Whenever they were injured, they would actually experienced less pain than someone who was lonely and was injured. They lived longer. They had a higher like rating or a more happy perspective
Hmm.
on life. They were more optimistic, and oftentimes they were much more successful.
Hmm.
So it gave birth to this idea of social fitness. How well can you relate to the people around you, and why does it matter?
Yeah. Wow. Do you have access to that study? Like, would I be able to link that?
Yeah, you could. It's
Okay.
ongoing. The new chair of the program. His name's Robert Waldinger, and
Hmm.
he just published a book about it in, I believe, 2022 called like the Happiness Project. But I'll make sure you have that.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm sure my followers would like to look at that. And
Hmm.
this is perfect. So you've explained why this is important to build relationships, make friends. What are some helpful tips regarding making friends? Can
Mm.
you share some for us?
Yeah, I can. And these are things that we've all heard whenever we
Mhm.
were little kids
Mhm.
that I'm sure our parents or those who were older than us would always talk to us about. And it was the basic things of share or go talk to somebody, or if somebody asks you a question, say yes or no, say yes or please. So
Mhm.
those common manners are there for a reason, right? And
Mhm.
there's that idea of we want to put into the world what we want out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So for relationships, though, as you grow older, what you'll find is after school and maybe you get your first job,
Mm-hmm.
you realize that it's a little harder to get relationships because you are no longer in the classroom with the same people for 8 hours a day.
Right.
And then maybe your friends get married, or maybe they go and move to a different country or state. Then you
Mm-hmm.
really have to work on it.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever that happens, there's a few tips I give people. And the first one's to reach out.
Mm-hmm.
You could do that in multiple ways. The best way would be face to face, but
Mm-hmm.
texting somebody, giving them a call.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is to plan with a date and a time. So if you could plan something and say, hey, let's go to the coffee shop on Tuesday at 7 p.m. after work, that's going to do so much more for you than just to say, hey, we should get together sometime, right?
Famous last words.
Right. We
You
should get
never
together
meet up
sometime.
with that person.
And then the third thing is to show up. And
Yeah.
this is very hard, and we do it, it's cyclical because once you reach out, you need to show up to wherever you're going, but then you need to show up again by
Mm-hmm.
reaching out, and you reach out
Mm-hmm.
and you show up. So
Mm-hmm.
reaching out and showing up are two like kind of platitudes that I've been thinking about, and there's a lot more to that, but I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, no, definitely. I like the way you simplified it. Just think about when you were a kid and what your parents told you to do to
Yeah.
make friends. But I also know it gets difficult, especially like you said, after college. And this question came directly from your profile. But
Yeah.
why does making friends seem like so much work?
Hmm. Yeah, this is a tough thing because we will always feel like it shouldn't be this hard.
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't be this hard to make friends.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you move to a new city and you get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm going to move and I have good friends here, good relationships here, but I'll be able to rebuild them.
Yeah.
And then you get there and a year later, you're like, man, I wasn't expecting it was going to be this challenging. Now, a big reason why is because a lot of our technological changes and our societal changes change much faster than our biological backbone, like our nervous system, our brains. That sounds weird when I say this, but whenever we were first figuring out as humans how to use fire and how to communicate, we were always in a group of people.
Mm-hmm.
Some anthropologists say 60 people, and we had to live together because we all had to take care of one another. One person would help guard the village, the hunters and the gatherers.
Mm-hmm.
Someone would go get meat, someone would take care of the kids. But now in our society, oftentimes we can do most things by ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
For a while, it was just two people.
Mm-hmm.
But even now, with like fertility practices that you can have kids, you can adopt, you can build a family just by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And this progression, all this advancement gives us a lot more independence and autonomy, and it
Mm-hmm.
takes away all of the opportunities we have to talk to people.
Yeah.
So with our high-speed internet, we can get Grubhub and or DoorDash,
Mm-hmm.
and we get food dropped off at our porch, so we don't see the person who delivers it.
Mm-hmm.
When historically we had to go out for our food, we had to talk to
Yeah.
a cashier,
Yeah.
talk to the person in line next to us. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just one example, but then there's thousands of those examples in our life that we don't think about, yet we recognize what it feels like to not have that.
Yeah, definitely. And we just came out of a pandemic. I think it's
Yes.
probably gotten worse since then.
Yeah, it has. And the
Mm-hmm.
something that we don't think about is the social, your ability to talk to people, your ability to relate with others, it's a
Mm-hmm.
muscle.
Yeah.
And when you don't use it, it will waste away, it will atrophy.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to go out and talk more.
Mm-hmm.
And we can be in debt. We can be in like financial debt if we owe somebody something, physical debt if we never exercise and
Mm-hmm.
we live unhealthy lives and we go to the gym and we're like, oh man, I'm gonna have to work very hard to get back to like a healthy level. With our social fitness, it's the same thing. If we don't
Mm-hmm.
talk to anybody for a long time and then we show up to a place where there's a lot of people, we feel so anxious, we don't know what to do. But after we do it for a while, we get to be at a more comfy level and it begins to give us life.
Yeah, it's like a muscle, which
Yes.
is this is perfect for most of my listeners who are learning another language. If they
Yeah.
study abroad, my biggest goal is to get them to immerse themselves and take the leap and practice speaking. And I think this is why it's so important. You have to meet people in the community. And I know there are countries that have like they're multilingual, so
Sure.
you can build community in your native language, but if you're really trying to learn the language, it really helps to I think this episode will reinforce that idea that it's important to build community and
Yeah,
relationships.
no, listen to Grace whenever she says that because
Yeah.
the reason I was a RA for a while, which
Oh,
I
cool.
yeah, went to university and everybody who lived on campus, I would help them.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever we had residents who were from a different country, we would intentionally pair them with somebody who was not from the same country as them. That
Mm-hmm.
way they would constantly be around a different culture.
Yeah.
And they, like you said, they'd be immersed in it. And
Mm-hmm.
before you know it, you are processing life in a
Mm-hmm.
language different than the one you're used to.
Yeah, that's great. I love that.
Mhm.
Um, okay, and then my last question are it's what are some out of the box questions people could ask those around them? And if you're comfortable with it, first, can you explain what out of the box means?
Yeah, out of the box
Yeah.
would be something that maybe you wouldn't expect. It may
Mm-hmm.
be surprising. It is something that typically is not there. If you can imagine a box and everything that we imagine or everything that we expect is in that box, out of the box, whoa, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
So the reason why this is important because we have a social script
Mm-hmm.
in every language, but in the United States, oftentimes we'll have questions that we always ask to people. And it feels like we're talking to them and connecting with them when really we're not connecting with them. It's not meaningful connection.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if we're the classic thing is the weather or how are you doing
Yeah.
or how's the day been or if
Mm-hmm.
you're in Chicago, how are the Chicago Bears doing? You know,
Mm-hmm.
like asking people about things everybody think about.
Yeah.
So if we can go beyond that script, go beyond those questions that people always ask, then it lends us, it gets us closer to having meaningful connection. And
Mm-hmm.
when I say meaningful connection, I mean conversation that you have that you're actually thinking about
Yeah.
and that you're taking into account the other person. So some good out of the box questions are largely going to depend on where you're at and what you're doing. And this
Mm-hmm.
is the beauty about talking to people is it's so contextual.
Mm-hmm.
If you're rock climbing, it is a really good practice to be able to observe people who are rock climbing and then ask them a specific question like, hey, I saw you do that certain thing.
Mm-hmm.
How did you learn how to do that? So it's an open-ended question, it's specific, and it's related to the activity.
Okay.
Now, you can do this in a lot of different areas, but depending on that activity, then you can build your question. Another question that I like to ask, and maybe you've discussed this, is rather than saying, how are you doing, being able to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you currently doing? And
Oh,
depending on if they answer a 7, then you could say, oh, what happened today that didn't make it a 6?
right.
Or is there a reason, what could get you to a 10?
Right.
Or I like to do like really out of the box questions. So when we're just hanging out, I'm like, hey, what's your thoughts on the NBA playing games in China now?
Yeah, great.
and and they may laugh, maybe they don't know anything about the NBA, but it jumbles things. It
Yeah.
switches it up. It changes what people expect.
Yeah.
And the sooner you can do that and not lose like people's comfort, I
Mm-hmm.
think it's good because then we just start to build whatever we want to build rather than follow the script.
Right. That's great. And
Yeah.
I think, well, this has happened to me a lot where you can tell people are predicting what you're going to say. And
Right.
it's kind of like when they say, I'm imagining they're going to say, "Oh yeah, I hope you have a good lunch." But I thought they were going to say have a good day and I say you too. I'm like, oh
Right.
wait, they're not having lunch.
Yes.
Like
I
that.
did that to somebody the other day. They said, they told me they were going to go do a workout. And I said, oh, hey, go have a good workout. And they're like, you too. And I'm like, I'm not going to work out.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think it makes these tips make the conversation more intentional,
Yes.
more authentic, and then it's just easier. We talk a lot about my students struggle with small talk because they don't want to sound robotic and inauthentic. And
Hmm.
so trying to give them other things they can discuss. And I think being specific to the situation is great.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, I think you started that today. You asked me right away. You said, "So, how many of these do you do a week, and how long have you been
Yeah.
podcasting?" Like right away, make it about that, and open ended is a really, really good tip.
And then you went off and answered them.
I did. I rolled with that. I didn't even know you were doing that. So that's great. Um, okay, and then this is the last part of the podcast, Chris, but I normally ask my guests to bring a quote, an idiom, or an expression that is related to the topic, or you can just share one that you like. And you already shared bread and butter, so that was great. But do you have anything that comes to
Yes.
mind?
Bread and butter was a good one.
It
I
was.
hope to figure that out. One quote that I've really been reflecting on is from The Hobbit.
Okay. Mhm.
Yeah. And it essentially says, you have no idea what can happen whenever you choose to step outside your door, all the adventures that could take place. And the reason why this has been sitting with me is oftentimes we have no idea what can happen when we choose to strike up a conversation. We don't
Mhm.
know. Like right now, I'm talking with you, and who knows, maybe in a year, I'll be where you're at and we'll be
Mhm.
sitting, whatever,
Yeah.
the opportunities are endless, but it requires us to take that step to leave our front door
Yeah.
and to get in the world.
Hmm. No, I love that. And actually, so for those of you who don't know, I found Chris on a podcast, like community
Yeah.
website, basically. And Chris, another man I interviewed on this podcast, his name's Richard. And we've been chatting, and I said, "Oh, I have a conference in LA coming up in October." He's like, "Great, we'll meet for coffee." And just those tiny
Wow.
little, but like you said, if I'm ever in Kansas, it's a
Yeah.
big state, but I'll look you up, and you never know what could happen. So that's a great quote. And you said
Yeah.
it's from The Hobbit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So taking that leap. And do you use that for public speaking a lot as well when you're doing
So I
and stuff?
was listening to a podcast earlier this week and she was saying it. And then ever since then I've been thinking about it and how it applies to some of the stuff I talk about.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah.
It's great. Okay. And can you let my listeners know where they can find you, kind of what you're up to,
Mhm.
and then of course I'll link anything in the podcast description.
My website is Talk to Chris Miller. And on that website, you can find the podcast that I create. I also write a newsletter that is pretty relevant to what we're doing here. It's
Hmm.
about living a better life by improving your relationships, conversations, and your community.
Hmm.
And it's supposed to be daily. There are some days wherever I miss the mark, but most of the time I'll write something out, I'll give resources. It's completely free. And that helps me because I get to think out my thoughts,
Hmm.
explore them. And then when I'm on the podcast, I can actually talk about it.
Yeah, that's great. You said this is your newsletter.
Yes. So the
W-
newsletter is called Social Fitness Lab.
Okay, social fitness. That's a new one for me, but I really love it and it makes perfect sense.
I know
So
it's one of those intuitive terms
yeah,
that as soon as you hear it, you know what it means.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And you said, are you on Instagram and social media and stuff?
Yes. Instagram, Talk to People podcast.
Talk to People podcast. Okay,
Yeah.
great. I will be sure to link all of that in the podcast description. And then, do you have any final thoughts, final recommendations before we wrap up?
My final thought is it's so cool that everyone who's listening to this, if you're choosing to learn English, then I am impressed.
Yes.
I have learned a little bit of other languages, and it can be a really tough, challenging thing. But from the people that I know who are fluent in another language, I have heard it's so rewarding to be able to have a full-blown conversation in a different language and to know what people mean and to connect with others. And I'm all about connecting with people, but unfortunately, I can only speak English. So imagine how many people you could connect with if you speak other languages.
Yes. Okay, Chris,
Yeah.
you've sparked another quote and I have to share it.
Uh-huh.
Have you heard the limits of your language are the limits of your world?
No, but it makes sense.
So good. As soon as you
Yeah.
learn another language, it just opens like another world for you to connect with. So
Yeah.
I hope that this interview with Chris has inspired you to keep studying, keep taking risks, and conversating with people. And Chris, thank you so, so much for taking the time to talk with me. This has been really insightful, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Grace, for having me on, and I hope you all have a great day.
All right, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for another episode of the English with Grace podcast. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did like this episode, please go ahead and like and subscribe and keep an eye out for more episodes coming soon.